Tim, but like, I think what we're really trying to do is help co-innovate with customers and bring them those delightful experiences and enable robots to be more than just a replacement, but enable them to be a key advocate in terms of transforming their business. So that's really my goal, is to help with that. Obviously not do all of that. That's a lot of work. So somewhere in there is like, like what's achievable versus what's a dream. But hey, like sometimes you got to dream big to actually achieve great things.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Hatchpad Insight. I'm Tim Winkler, creator of Hatchpad, the community connecting innovative startups and progressive engineers. If this is your first time here, don't forget to hit subscribe for updates on new Insight interviews like this one. Today, we're chatting with Vaibhav Vohra, the Senior Vice President of Product at Gecko Robotics, an industrial inspection robotics startup headquartered in Pittsburgh. Vaibhav, thanks for hanging out with us at the Hatchpad.
Absolutely. It's great to be here, Tim. As Tim mentioned, I'm the SVP of product at Gecko Robotics, based out of Pittsburgh. And Gecko Robotics is essentially a company that's building robots and software that enable the industrials like oil and gas, pulp and paper, power companies to inspect their assets in a much safer way than it occurs today. So we built out these robotic crawlers that enable inspection managers and engineers to access areas at much less risk, reduce emissions, and really save costs. So really excited at our mission statement and how we're bringing it to life.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's a super fascinating area that you all are playing in. And, you coming in as the senior VP of product development, I'm curious, your background, getting into this role. Tell me a little bit about where you came from as a SVP of product.
So, it's kind of an interesting journey. I kind of started out in my career working in aerospace. So I used to design satellites on the hardware side. And then I joined SAP, which is a software company. And so it was a pretty hard right turn, but it was just, super fascinating to me of like, doing things in both the hardware side of the world, building satellites and then building enterprise software. Obviously, they're not really related, but they both kind of tackle some very, important problems. And throughout my career at SAP, I launched 5 or 6 cloud products in about a 7-year time span, including data as a service, insight platforms, customer experience. And I think that the benefit of being part of SAP is, of course, like 80% of the world's transactions go through their systems. SAP systems are required for companies and customers to be successful. So I think kind of learning those lessons, was a big part of it. And obviously, after SAP, I was part of Bossa Nova Robotics, another Pittsburgh-based startup, which was, had fully autonomous robots in retail. So, there's kind of an interesting journey there of like, satellites to enterprise software to robots, which leads me here to Gecko. It's been a wild journey and something that I've really enjoyed, learning as I go along.
Wonderful. That's a great background. Let's just jump right into the first question here based on that. So interested to hear more on your perspective coming from, Silicon Valley, working with a large enterprise company like SAP, and then moving into this startup environment. Obviously it's a very different ecosystem in Pittsburgh where, Gecko Robotics is headquartered. Can you talk a little bit about, that transition and maybe what challenges you faced during the process of going from that environment into a startup environment?
Yeah, for sure. I think, the Valley, I feel like one thing that happens around here is you kind of get pigeonholed into being a hardware company or a software company. You kind of have to declare who you are, right, at any given time. But obviously the world is much more complex than that. And I think the startup community in Pittsburgh has really kind of embodied that with robotics and all that's going on. You need both software to succeed. I think that, the journey here in the Valley has been all about taking products from 0 to 1. And then how do you create these connected customer experiences, and really broadening the horizons. And of course, it's a unique set of challenges that exist at scale. One of the things that happens is like, you have to make these critical decisions on, not just listening to all customers on everything they say, and acting on it, but deciding, really what's the key feedback that we need to take and launch our new innovations. And then there's all sorts of other things that come from that, like, sustainable business models. How do you ensure that success is repeatable, that it's not just acquiring revenue, that like there's a master plan. So I think at scale, you run into also like partnerships and, something that's accretive to both sides. Whereas, when you start, you're kind of oftentimes not ready to take on those go-to-market partnerships and others. So I think that's one thing that's really kind of a lesson that I've learned across time. And probably, when you do get to scale, in the Valley, a lot of it is around, really taking your value proposition and being very, very succinct, and brief in terms of describing yourself to companies. So simplifying your pitch, is something that gets very crucial, as you move further and further up. And then I think, one of the other things that's there is, the whole verticalization, that when you're a startup, you're oftentimes just focused on like one or two industries, and then you start growing and finding, applicability. So how do you keep, the core of the product something that's in common, but you also need to find ways to really hit your customers for their unique pain points, whether it's in retail or oil and gas. So I think that verticalization of the value prop and also of your company is something else that, is super important. And then, just to kind of wrap it up in terms of like things that, learnings along the way in Silicon Valley is, when do you take a risk versus wait? Like patience in terms of investing in new areas and new ideas versus just, taking the risk and saying, look, we may have a proof point here where we might be onto something. And so having that discipline and kind of that risk taking mindset that got you there in the first place. So these are just some things that, like, I think, learning along the way, in my like 0 to 1 and scale journey that I feel like, most companies can definitely, utilize in their thought process.
I'm curious with transitioning out of Silicon Valley. First off, I guess how many years was that a part of your life?
Yeah, so it was about a decade I spent here. Traffic was a lot better. I think that in terms of transitioning out, I feel, there's a lot of there's a lot of good things in Silicon Valley. There's probably, areas that like anywhere need improvement. I think that what's really cool is like how many companies get started every year, of course, and like the velocity. But I also think that sometimes it becomes a little bit like FOMO in doing what everyone else is doing. And I think that some ways makes it hard to be a one of one, because there's so much pressure to be, the Twilio of X or the Google of Y.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's better not to use that language, because it creates a series of expectations of, hey, you need to innovate in their way, and this was their growth story. So you can't create your own destiny in many ways, because you're compared against, other companies, and they might be motivated for different reasons than you as a startup are. Like they might be, looking at valuation and all that stuff, but like, some companies are more focused on solving customer problems and growing, by bootstrapping. So I think that, like, the FOMO is definitely real there. I think, in terms of like, making the transition, I find that, Pittsburgh definitely has the technical talent that the Valley has. The big thing that I feel like I can help with is just this enterprise software kind of way of thinking, enterprise hardware, in terms of like what happens in those scale stories that we talked about.
Mhm.
But I think, overall the journey has been pretty good. People are very friendly in Pittsburgh. They love to chalk it up. And I think the cool thing and what I see starting in Pittsburgh that I definitely think that was in the Valley is kind of groups of startups talking with each other to help each other out. And like, hey, like, we need to work with, we have this problem. How do we solve it? Like whether it's organizational or otherwise. So I think that's where, I'm really excited, is that it doesn't seem like everyone has all the answers, which is partly refreshing, that it's like, it's still a journey where everyone's going along with each other. I think sometimes in the Valley, everyone feels like they have an answer. So it's like, it's good to know that not everything is figured out. And that's probably where I like, innovation to be, is where you still feel uncomfortable. And you don't feel as much pressure to follow up with the company across the street. I think the transition is going really well. I think one of the concepts I thought was, really fascinating is how, folks in Pittsburgh do adapt so quickly. I think that's one, advantage of the region. Just think about, how steel, oil, paint was such a big part of the culture 30 years ago, in terms of the physical, aspects there. And now it's like Robotown, like everyone calls it Robotown. So, I think that the culture and the mindset is definitely, supportive of this type of work. And they really take it as a source of pride. And I think that's kind of a cool thing is, I think there's so many other things going on in Silicon Valley that, like, there's not really a core competency anymore, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But I think it's doing one thing really well and then building adjacencies is what I see, Pittsburgh doing, is like, this robotics kind of machine vision as a core competency, and then building out from that, makes it a unique culture in my mind.
It's fascinating. I'm curious. Everybody's got a different definition of, I guess, of startup, right? Some startups in the DC metro area, they still call them startups, and they're 500
Yep.
employees. I think Gecko Robotics is, at its core, a great definition of a startup story. Can you just quickly explain how the company was founded?
Yeah.
Did it come out of an accelerator program? Was it bootstrapped? Just kind of quick
Yeah.
on that, just so the audience has some perspective of when they hear you coming into a startup, just exactly what size it was.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that like, this whole concept of startups, like everyone's a startup at some point and always is. But yeah, I think the company is really interesting from its inception. It obviously came from Y Combinator, which is kind of a critical part of many companies' success.
Mhm.
But really the interesting thing was more of founders coming from Pittsburgh and really building something to help an industry that was very near and dear to their hearts, and a mission statement of helping improve humanity. Like, being from Pittsburgh, you definitely see like the industrials like everywhere you go, and kind of the history of the town. So I think that like, the startup journey really began in Pittsburgh, and there was obviously the Y Combinator piece, but kind of woven into the fabric is this understanding that like, innovation can happen in these areas that most people don't oftentimes look for. Most people, when they think of innovation, they think of like fintech or e-commerce or social media, but sometimes like innovation happens in areas where people, there's a vast underserved population for it. So I think it's kind of doing something different than what most people think of as like, yeah, let's go into SaaS, into this like great industry that everyone knows and loves, like retail or CPGs. But sometimes really innovating means going to those hard industries and solving some very tough pain points that most people don't have appreciation for.
Mm. What is the type of mold when you look at folks that are going to come in from an engineering or a product perspective that would, I guess, adapt well in this environment? It
Yeah.
is very specific to a vertical. I'm curious to hear, as a senior vice president, as you're building your team, what is it that you would say makes for a good, not just cultural fit, but also is going to be someone that thrives in a vertical specific industry like oil and gas?
Yeah, I think part of innovating in industries like this is you have to really get past this idea that like, look, there's traditional industries and then there's like these new industries and like the excitements in the new industries. And if you really start kind of peeling the onion on what's happening, like the trivial solution is like, look, technology is not adopted. But if you really start looking carefully and start understanding and spending time in this space, you find that most people who work there are very curious and practical, which is the perfect opportunity for innovation. And much like most industries, they're looking for the right tool for the job. So, in oil and gas or mining or pulp and paper, like the tools may be physical, but they're willing to explore digital tools. You just have to like get to this fundamental pain point. So much like for Gecko, what we did was we sat there, with these power companies, with these oil and gas companies, and just figured out like, hey, like how do we help save people's lives? How do we avoid putting them in difficult situation and scaffolds, that are 40, 60 feet up in the air? How do we reduce costs in terms of getting the data as quickly as possible? And so that's how we came to the solution of robotics, figuring out a problem and then focusing on the solution. But really, finding people that just cared so much about helping an area where technology has not yet made its rounds.
Mhm.
And I think it's just having that mindset of grit. And I think that's super powerful from an innovation standpoint, that not all innovation is something that everyone touches and feels every day. That a lot of innovation happens because there's just a tremendous amount of grit. And I think, part of Gecko's mindset is, we find peace and solemn inside, the hard hat culture, because that's who we are. And a lot of people can't really, have that mindset because they find those environments to be very like, scary because it's different. But if you can sit there with them and the people that do this job day in and day out, what you'll find is that like these are some of the most hardworking people that are very interested in doing things in new ways. And a lot of it is just showing that empathy for getting into that space, and putting on your boots and your hard hat and just sitting there and mocking up UX designs. And that's how software is really built. So I think a lot of this is that grit that I talked about, and a lot of it is just thinking about innovation as something that's not just getting more likes or more pluses, right? There's a huge thing to be said about how innovation is changing, and I think being here in Pittsburgh, I think that's a great segue to that.
So you were brought in not too long ago,
Yeah.
and If you can maybe just expand on, why you were specifically, brought into the business. What is it that you are tasked to build at this point?
Yeah, I think, for here at Gecko, we're trying to obviously build our next generation of robots and hardware to get more and more coverage and try to help scan as many assets as we can, whether it's like boilers, tubes, pipes, vessels. So part of it is like trying to tackle some of those challenges of doing more and more in confined spaces that other technologies can't. So I think some of that is just the exploration and new industries. I think the second part is just thinking about the role that all these workflows have. That once you get the data, what do you do with it? So a lot of companies kind of go deep into the data space, but not many go into the insight space of let's uncover some really interesting things that help the workers do a better job, whether it's the inspectors or the engineers. There's a kind of a joke where all SaaS products start with displacing Excel. So I guess you could say Excel might be the world's greatest product because everyone's trying to displace it with software. But it's definitely true in this case. Like if you think about all the data that exists, whether it's in Chalks or Binder or other kind of data systems, like we're trying to really democratize that data, bring it all together, get our hands dirty, and really bring this thing together to provide these insights and models that no one has of when is something likely to corrode and end of life. So I think we're willing to get into those kind of central problems, in terms of data management and just building out models and doing a better job of helping them generate actionable insights. So I think part of our journey is of course going into a lot of new markets and serving the new spaces and assets we can scan. But what we're really looking to do is just disrupt that whole space of like how data is generated. How do we get people to be more efficient? And it's probably true for most industries where you're just trying to get people to be more efficient to the tasks that they want to do. And I think that's kind of a larger space topic on robotics. So robotics, people oftentimes fall in love with like, wow, that's such a cool robot. It has LiDAR or it has, this cool camera or it can like do this kind of localization or it's fully autonomous level 4, right? Or level 5. But I think, for customers, what they really care about is business value and what it's generating. And so if you can get a robot not to replace people, which is important, a lot of people think about robots as replacing people. If you can get them to help people and reduce the amount of time they spend, that's a game changer. And that's where robotics, I think, is really going to go, is not so much like, let's try to replace jobs, but let's try to help people, spend less time on the things that they'd rather not and focus on their discipline, because that's how satisfaction goes up. That's how automation goes up. That's how you really effectively use technology. And I think that's where I think Gecko's trying to do as well, is say, look, these are dangerous places and you have data in all these areas, and you're incurring all these costs, and you'd rather spend time just thinking about what this data means rather than accumulating the data and getting it going in difficult places.
Mhm.
We want to be part of that simplification journey that enables them to be successful. So I think, going back to kind of a long answer to your question, Tim, but like, I think what we're really trying to do is help co-innovate with customers and bring them those delightful experiences and enable robots to be more than just a replacement, but enable them to be a key advocate in terms of transforming their business.
Mm.
So that's really my goal, is to help with that. Obviously not do all of that. That's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So somewhere in there is like, like what's achievable versus what's a dream. But hey, like sometimes you got to dream big to actually achieve great things.
Yeah, I love the like the safety aspect of it, and the whole point of not deploying robots to replace people, but to help simplify some of their tasks, or the safety element, making their jobs a little bit
Yep.
less risky by use of technology. What's the size of Gecko Robotics from a headcount perspective?
We're a fairly small company at the moment, fairly close. It's about 100 to 115 people at the moment, which is great to be part of this journey at the inception. And I think this is where a lot of the people that are part of our teams are distributed across Texas and Pittsburgh. We're serving a lot of industries, and of course, like we have kind of large engineering teams that we're building up, which makes this particularly exciting. And I think that's kind of where, when we think about robotics companies, the interesting secret is robotics companies, of course, hire hardware engineers, whether they're mechanical engineers or electrical engineers. But great robotics companies actually focus on software, because the robots need to run well and you need to do something with the data they collect. So that's really where we're focusing on is building up, amazing software talent and hardware talent.
And you mentioned that the teams are a bit distributed amongst Texas and Pittsburgh. Is the hiring philosophy, or I guess traditionally, has it been to find folks that are local to the region, or what's the hiring philosophy when it comes to location and how you all are still trying to keep a culture amongst the team?
I think this is where, obviously, from an engineering standpoint, we love having the team in Pittsburgh, great universities, Pitt, CMU. We love having kind of that, and this is probably a debate, like, is Pittsburgh part of the East Coast or Midwest? I'll steer clear of that, right? I'll claim that, like, I'm not originally from here, so, like, I won't like put my hat in that ring. But yeah, I think we, obviously we've had to adapt to find great talent. But, like, I think what's always interesting is, like, how that region has this, like, intellectual curiosity at these problems, and they're kind of interested in solving them, like whether it's robotics or software. I think it's the industrial, like, nature of curiosity, where they can look into this culture of grit and making something humans want and really disrupting something new. So it's kind of a difficult mindset to just find people that have that. And it's probably some advice for anyone, like, looking for a job, is not just to think about, the problems that you've seen that you like, but the problems that no one is solving, and find companies that help solve those. And I think that I do definitely find that, in the Pittsburgh area, there's a lot of people curious as to what's next and how they can play a part in this, whether it's the renewable space or energy or whatever, of solving some of these challenges. Because it's the world always, I feel like, it always rewards people that think differently about solving problems that other people aren't solving. So it takes a unique kind of mindset to do this, for sure.
What would be a key piece of advice from another type of product person coming into a role that say somebody that wants to explore a role with a startup that's at a technical leadership level, like a VP position, in a startup environment? Any kind of quick hits of advice for an individual like that to
Yeah.
adapt to the environment?
Yeah, I think one is, I think especially coming in from a bigger environment, there's kind of a clear, like, the term swim lane is used quite frequently. Like, this is your swim lane, please play well here. And I know, a lot of the cultures of big companies, swim lanes become more important, and for the right reasons. I think when you get to a startup around 100 or 200 people, the term swim lane is less appropriate. It's more like, these are your general zones of the ocean to go in. Like, don't go in the deep end, don't go on this side, but obviously peek your head in so you can help. So I feel like the growth mindset means that, if you work in product, you should help with engineering, or you should help with sales. If you work in marketing, you should help with, customer stuff, but you should also help understand how does operations work. So I think this general idea, I'd say one big thing is, dip your toe in everything, because you will be asked. So I think there's that kind of, like, servant leadership or cross-functional nature of it. That's huge. I think the second thing I would probably say is, you kind of know where your limitations and lack of expertise is, and be very clear with everyone about it. Because while no one expects anyone else to be perfect, I think there is a level of candid and honesty that's more expected at the 100 or 200 person company, just for the success of the company as a whole. Hey, I don't know how to do this, or I can't do this well. And being very open to disclosing that, like, hey, like, this is probably where you can help me, and this is where I can help you. I find that, like, you have to be super transparent about strengths, and then hire around it if needed. But just being very candid and honest. I'd say the last thing is just, obviously the titles become, very much of a stickler, but it becomes, obviously, I think in the startup world, it's much more prove it, and then you will get the next title. Whereas I think being part of a big company, it's sort of part of your growth is, hey, I hit this target, and this is what I did. And, like, I feel like it's much more of a general feeling that this person should take this thing on. And it's becomes a little more vague. So I'd say just being very, very understanding of, like, success will be shared as a group and lost as a group, and that individual accolades are not really why people should join startup or otherwise. It's you're here to make people successful, and especially as an executive, and not make yourself successful. So I think forgetting about, like, maybe necessarily, like, these are the things that got you success at a big company, but treating success or failure as very personal, but also part of a bigger picture. So, I mean, those are three kind of things that just come to mind, off the top of my head. for
Those are
anyone with that kind
great.
of stuff.
Well, this has been a great discussion. Again, thank you, Vaibhav, for spending time with us. If you like this video, don't forget to hit thumbs up and subscribe for future updates, and catch us on the next Hatchpad Insight.